7 kilometers. That's the distance between two pieces of the same pink blanket. One half buried in a family's trash bin. The other half snagged on branches deep in the Nova Scotia wilderness. 7 kilometers that a 6-year-old girl named Lilly Sullivan could never have traveled alone. 7 kilometers that would expose one of the most calculated deceptions in Canadian criminal history. I need you to pause right now and think about that distance. 7 kilometers. That's not a child dropping their comfort blanket while lost in the woods. That's someone with a plan, a vehicle, and 45 minutes in the middle of the night to make sure those pieces were found exactly where they needed to be. Before we go any further into what really happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan, I need to know you're ready for this. Because this isn't a story about children who wandered into the woods. This is about something far more deliberate, far more sinister. If you're ready to see the evidence that investigators missed for weeks, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to show you will change how you see every missing children case forever. The date was May 2nd, 2010, in rural Pictou County, Nova Scotia. But this story doesn't start with a frantic 911 call or search parties in the woods. It starts with a piece of torn fabric that should never have existed. The volunteer didn't think much of it at first. Searching through a family's trash during a missing persons investigation feels invasive, uncomfortable. But after 3 weeks of finding nothing in the endless forests of Pictou County, investigators were getting desperate. Every conventional search method had failed. Helicopters, drones, trained dogs, hundreds of volunteers, all of them finding the same thing. Nothing. So when this volunteer saw pink fabric in the Sullivan family's garbage bin, something clicked. Not because trash is unusual, but because for 3 weeks, they heard Molly Brooks Murray, the children's mother, make the same plea on every news broadcast. My daughter Lily loves her pink blanket. She carries it everywhere. She must be so scared without it. The volunteer pulled the fabric from the trash. It was roughly half of a child's blanket. The edges weren't cut clean. They were jagged, torn deliberately.
And it was pink.
Lily's signature color. That half blanket sat in an evidence bag for 2 days before the call came in. A different search team, working a grid 7 kilometers away along a remote ATV trail, had found something. More pink fabric. Snagged on branches at eye level, as if someone wanted it to be found. When DNA analysis confirmed both pieces belonged to the same blanket, belonged to Lilly Sullivan's blanket, the investigation shifted from search and rescue to something much darker. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. If your 6-year-old daughter was missing in the woods and you found half of her beloved blanket, what would you do? You'd turn it over to police immediately, right? You'd beg them to test it, to use it to track her scent, to find any clue about where she might be. You certainly wouldn't tear it in half and throw one piece in your household garbage. But that's exactly what someone did. The RCMP brought in forensic specialists to examine both pieces. The tear patterns matched perfectly. These pieces had been deliberately separated, not accidentally torn. And the location of that second piece, 7 kilometers away on a remote trail, that wasn't random. Someone had traveled there intentionally. That's when investigators pulled ATV rental records from every outfitter in Pictou County. What they found made their blood run cold. On May 1st, the night before Lilly and Jack were reported missing, someone had rented an all-terrain vehicle from a local shop. The rental agreement was time-stamped at 9:30 p.m. Cash payment. No credit card, no traceable transaction. The vehicle was returned before dawn on May 2nd, hours before anyone would report the children missing. Now here's where it gets chilling. Modern ATVs, especially rentals, have GPS tracking for liability purposes. The rental company's logs showed exactly where that vehicle had traveled, and the route matched perfectly with the location where the second piece of Lily's blanket was found. But there's more. Cell tower data from that area showed the ATV had stopped moving for exactly 45 minutes at that remote location. 45 minutes. Not a quick stop. Not someone pausing to check directions. This was someone who parked, got off the vehicle, walked into the woods, did something very specific, and walked back. I want you to comment right now and tell me what you think happened during those 45 minutes. Because investigators had their theory, and it was about to get much worse. The cell towers that tracked that ATV also tracked every mobile phone in the area that night. Standard protocol for missing persons cases. Check who was where when. And one phone signal appeared on the data that made investigators stop breathing. A phone registered to Molly Brooks Murray pinged a tower just 20 minutes away from that remote trail at exactly midnight on May 1st. 20 minutes away from where her daughter's blanket would be found. At midnight. On the night before she reported her children missing. Now, this might not seem immediately damning. Molly lived in the area. Her phone pinging local towers wouldn't normally raise red flags. Except for one critical detail. Molly had told investigators, told the media, told everyone who would listen that she had been out of province that entire evening, visiting family, hours away from Pictou County. She had an alibi. She had claimed she wasn't even in Nova Scotia when her children disappeared. But cell towers don't lie. They document every ping, every connection, every moment of phone searches for signal. And Molly's phone wasn't hours away visiting family. It was 20 minutes from a remote trail where someone had just spent 45 minutes doing something in the dark. When investigators confronted Molly with this data, they watched something extraordinary happen. Not tears. Not panic. Not the reaction of a mother whose alibi had just fallen apart. They watched calculation. They watched someone's story begin to shift in real time, searching for a new narrative that might explain away the impossible. There were no flight records with her name. No hotel receipts from the location she claimed to have visited. No witnesses who could place her anywhere except exactly where her phone said she was. The alibi she had been clinging to for weeks dissolved like morning fog. But investigators needed more than cell phone data. They needed physical evidence. They needed something that would be impossible to explain away as coincidence or faulty technology. So they moved quickly to secure Molly's rental car, the vehicle she'd been driving during the time period in question. What forensic specialists found in that trunk would remove any remaining doubt about what they were dealing with. A single pink sock. Small. Child-sized. The kind a 6-year-old girl might wear. But this wasn't a clean sock that had fallen out of laundry. This sock was embedded with woodland debris. Leaves, dirt, pine needles, organic matter you'd find deep in forest undergrowth. The kind of place you'd only go if you were searching for something or hiding something. A granola bar. Half-eaten. Small teeth marks still visible in the remaining portion. When forensic odontologists compared those bite marks to Jack Sullivan's dental records, they found a perfect match. 4-year-old Jack had bitten into that granola bar. And then someone had placed it in the trunk of his mother's car. And finally, the evidence that made even seasoned investigators feel sick. A tuft of blonde hair, entwined with pink fabric fibers. Independent forensic analysis confirmed the hair belonged to Lilly Sullivan. The fibers matched exactly the composition of her torn blanket. But it wasn't just the match that disturbed investigators. It was the way the hair and fibers were intertwined, wound together in a pattern that forensic experts testified could not occur through casual contact or accidental transfer. Someone had deliberately placed these items together. Someone who had access to both Lilly and her blanket. Someone who had been in close physical contact with her around the time she disappeared. Someone whose trunk had become a repository for evidence they thought would never be found. Let me paint you a picture of what investigators were now seeing. Not a tragic accident. Not children wandering off, but a meticulously planned operation. An ATV rented the night before with cash. A torn blanket with pieces strategically placed 7 kilometers apart to create a false trail. Cell phone data placing the mother nowhere near her claimed alibi. Physical evidence in her vehicle linking her directly to both children at the time of their disappearance. This wasn't loss. This was deception.
But why?
Why would a mother go to such elaborate lengths to make her own children disappear? What could possibly motivate someone to create this level of choreographed misdirection? The answer to that question was hiding in plain sight, recorded in her own voice, practiced and perfected dozens of times before anyone knew to look for it. If you're still watching, you need to hear what investigators found next. Because the torn blanket, the ATV rental, the cell phone data, all of that was just the beginning. What came next would reveal not just what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan, but the calculated performance that kept an entire community searching in exactly the wrong direction while the truth was being buried 7 kilometers away. Make sure you're subscribed, because this case is about to expose something that will make you question every tearful plea you've ever seen on the news. There's a moment in every major investigation when detectives realize they've been looking at evidence backwards. When puzzle pieces they thought were random suddenly form a pattern so clear, so deliberate, it's shocking no one saw it earlier. For the RCMP investigators working the Sullivan case, that moment came when they obtained warrants for Molly Brooks Murray's digital devices. What they found wasn't the panicked internet searches of a desperate mother. It was a blueprint. The cyber crimes unit started with her phone. Standard procedure: check recent calls, messages, internet history. But Molly had been careful. She deleted almost everything, cleared her browser history, removed messaging apps, factory reset her devices multiple times in the weeks following the disappearance. For most people, that would be enough to hide their digital tracks. But here's what most people don't understand about digital evidence. Deletion doesn't mean gone. It means hidden. And cloud backups remember everything. When investigators accessed Molly's cloud storage accounts, they discovered files that painted a picture of someone who had been preparing for this moment not for days, but for months. Encrypted folders containing documents most mothers would never think to create. Search histories that revealed a mind obsessively focused on one question: how do you make someone disappear without leaving evidence? The search terms were chilling in their specificity. How long before missing persons case goes cold? ATV rental cash payment no ID. Cellular tower coverage maps Nova Scotia. Child DNA degradation timeline. Each search carefully timed and executed through encrypted browsers designed to hide online activity from casual observers. This wasn't someone frantically Googling in a moment of panic. This was research. Methodical, thorough, clinical research into how to commit the perfect crime. But the searches were just the beginning. Hidden in a subfolder that Molly had marked as tax documents, investigators found something that would become the prosecution's most damning evidence. Voice memo files.
Dozens of them.
All recorded in the weeks before May 2nd. The first file investigators listened to contained 7 words that made the entire room go silent. Please bring them home. I'm begging you. It was Molly's voice. Broken.
Desperate.
Exactly the tone she would use weeks later in her televised appeals. Except this recording was made on April 15th, 17 days before her children were reported missing. The next file contained the same phrase, but slightly different. The pacing adjusted. The emotional catch in her voice moved from the word please to the word home. It was the same plea, refined, perfected. Take 2 of a performance. Investigators found 43 different voice memo files in that folder, all of them containing phrases Molly would later use in public. My babies must be so scared. They're so little. Lily loves her pink blanket. She carries it everywhere. If anyone has seen them, please come forward. Each phrase recorded multiple times with subtle variations in tone, pacing, emotional intensity. Audio forensic specialists brought in to analyze these recordings confirmed what investigators suspected. These weren't spontaneous expressions of grief. These were rehearsals. Each successive recording showed more control, less genuine emotion, more calculated delivery. The vocal stress patterns, the micro-expressions in her voice, all of it indicated someone practicing lines for a performance they knew was coming. But perhaps the most disturbing file in that collection was the last one Molly recorded. April 30th, 2 days before the disappearance. In it, her voice was steady, controlled, almost businesslike. After this, nobody searches here again. Once they're gone, the story takes over. Just stick to the script. Stick to the script. Those 4 words revealed everything. This wasn't a mother preparing for the worst. This was someone preparing to execute a plan she'd already decided on. A plan that involved her children being gone, and her performance being believable enough that no one would question her. I need you to stop and think about what that means. Imagine sitting alone in your car or your bedroom, recording yourself crying, playing it back, adjusting your tone, recording again. Perfecting the exact pitch of desperation that will make people believe you. Doing that not once, but 43 times. What kind of mind does that require? What level of detachment from your own children does that take? Comment below and tell me, have you ever seen something like this in a true crime case? Because I've covered hundreds of cases, and this level of premeditation is rare. This isn't heat of the moment. This isn't panic. This is cold, calculated theater. But Molly hadn't been practicing alone. As investigators dug deeper into her digital records, they found evidence of coordination. Deleted messaging apps that had been used to communicate with someone investigators hadn't yet identified. The messages themselves were gone, scrubbed from every device. But metadata remained. Timestamps showing conversations lasting hours in the weeks before the disappearance. Call logs showing contact with multiple burner phones, untraceable devices purchased with cash for the specific purpose of avoiding detection. One pattern emerged that particularly interested investigators. Every Sunday night for 6 weeks before May 2nd, Molly's phone showed a data spike consistent with video calling. Each call lasted between 45 minutes and 2 hours. Each call connected to an IP address that routed through multiple proxy servers designed to hide the caller's true location. Someone had been teaching Molly operational security. Someone with experience avoiding law enforcement surveillance. Then came the anonymous packages. It started with a single USB drive, left in the mailbox of an RCMP detachment in New Glasgow. No note. No return address. Just a drive containing audio files that would crack this case wide open. The files were recordings from a smart home device. The kind of always listening speaker that sits in millions of homes, responding to voice commands, playing music, setting timers. Most people forget these devices are constantly recording ambient audio, storing it in cloud servers, creating an inadvertent surveillance record of everything said within range. Someone had hacked into the Sullivan family's smart device and extracted weeks of audio recordings. Then they'd edited those recordings down to the most relevant conversations and delivered them to police. To this day, investigators don't know who sent those files. But what those files contained would reveal the full scope of the conspiracy. The first recording played in the evidence room was date-stamped April 23rd. 2 voices. Molly and someone else.
Male.
Speaking in hushed tones. The quality wasn't perfect, but the words were clear enough. The male voice. Dispose of evidence after dark. No lights. Nobody sees the vehicle. Molly's response. The blanket needs to be torn. Make it look like they tried to hold on to it. Like they were scared. Another recording. April 27th. The same 2 voices, this time discussing logistics with the casual efficiency of people planning a business meeting rather than a crime. Male voice. The ATV rental has to be cash. No credit cards, no paper trail. You pick it up, you drive the route, you're back before sunrise. Molly. I'll handle the alibis. I know exactly what to tell them. I've practiced. Male voice. And the timeline? Molly. May 2nd. Early morning. By the time anyone realizes they're gone, we'll be 12 hours ahead of any search. Investigators listened to recording after recording, each one revealing another layer of planning. They discussed evidence disposal. They discussed creating false trails. They discussed media management and how to keep investigators focused on wilderness searches while the truth was being hidden somewhere else entirely. But what disturbed investigators most wasn't the planning itself. It was how they referred to the children. Not as Lilly and Jack. Not as your kids or your daughter and son. Just them. The problems. What we need to deal with. The emotional distance in their voices, the clinical way they discussed making 2 human beings disappear, suggested a level of psychological detachment that forensic psychologists would later describe as sociopathic. These weren't people torn apart by difficult circumstances. These were people executing a business transaction. Armed with these recordings, investigators began the painstaking process of identifying the male voice. Audio analysis, voice pattern recognition, and cross-referencing with known associates led them to someone who had been hiding in plain sight. Someone who had been present during search efforts, offering comfort and support to the grieving family. Someone who had stood next to Molly during press conferences, a friend in her time of need. His name was Derek Hammond, a family acquaintance who had known the Sullivans for years. On paper, he was a construction contractor. But what investigators would discover about Derek Hammond's background would reveal why Molly had chosen him as a co-conspirator. He had experience making things disappear. Not children, at least not that they could prove, but evidence, assets, paper trails. He'd been investigated twice for fraud related to construction projects where materials and money had vanished without proper accounting. Nothing had ever been proven. Derek was good at covering his tracks. And now he'd brought that expertise to something far more sinister. Cell phone records confirmed what the voice analysis suggested. Derek's phone had pinged the same towers as Molly's on the night of May 1st. He'd been 20 minutes away from that remote ATV trail at the same time she was. Financial records showed he'd made large cash withdrawals in the days before the disappearance, amounts that matched the cost of ATV rentals, supply purchases, and other expenses associated with the plan. And surveillance footage from multiple locations showed him traveling the same routes at the same times as Molly. Not together in the same vehicle, that would be too obvious. But parallel paths, coordinated movements, the signature of people executing a shared plan. But investigators still faced the question that haunted them.
Why?
What possible motivation could drive a mother to go to these lengths? What could Molly Brooks Murray gain from making her own children disappear? The answer came from financial records that painted a picture of someone drowning in debt. Credit cards maxed out. Gambling losses totaling over $80,000. Money owed to people who don't accept payment plans. Molly wasn't just in financial trouble. She was in the kind of trouble that ruins lives and sometimes ends them. Then investigators found the wire transfer. April 10th, 22 days before the disappearance. $50,000 deposited into an account Molly had opened under a false business name. The transfer came from an offshore account that would take international cooperation to trace. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Derek Hammond's interrogation would later reveal what that payment was for. It was a down payment. Half now, half when the job was complete. Molly had been paid to make her children available to people who specialized in making kids disappear permanently. Not through violence, Derek insisted. Through relocation, new identities, placement with people who wanted children and weren't concerned about legal adoption processes. Lilly and Jack Sullivan had been sold by their own mother for money to pay off gambling debts. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 children, 6 and 4 years old, valued at $100,000 total. $50,000 upfront. $50,000 on completion. That's the price Molly Brooks Murray had placed on her own kids. If you're feeling sick right now, you should be. If you're wondering how a human being becomes capable of this, join the investigators who spent months trying to understand the same thing. Comment below and tell me, what do you think should happen to someone who does this? Because the legal system was about to face that exact question. But first, investigators needed to find Lilly and Jack. Because all the evidence in the world, all the voice recordings and financial transactions and cell phone data, none of it mattered if those children couldn't be brought home. And with each passing day, they were getting further away from any chance of being found. The investigation was about to shift from building a case to executing a rescue operation. Because investigators now knew exactly who was responsible for the disappearance. What they didn't know was where Lilly and Jack Sullivan were right now, or whether they were still alive. While investigators were uncovering the digital evidence of Molly's planning, she was delivering the performance of her life in front of cameras, search volunteers, and anyone who would listen. What nobody realized at the time was that every tear, every plea, every moment of her public grief was exactly what she'd rehearsed 43 times in those voice memos. The RCMP's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in to review hundreds of hours of footage. Press conferences, television interviews, interactions with search volunteers, even casual conversations captured on bystanders' phones. What they found was a masterclass in manipulation that had fooled trained professionals, journalists, and an entire community. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychologist specializing in deceptive behavior, led the analysis team. Years later, she would describe watching Molly's performances as one of the most unsettling experiences of her career. Every micro-expression was controlled. Every gesture was calculated. And most disturbing, every emotional response was perfectly calibrated to generate maximum sympathy while deflecting any potential suspicion. But the analysts noticed something civilian observers had missed. In moments when Molly thought she wasn't being watched, when cameras weren't rolling, or when she'd stepped away from search groups, her entire demeanor changed. The grief disappeared like a switched-off light, replaced by something cold and calculating. Security footage from a convenience store captured one of these moments. It was day 7 of the search. Molly had stopped to buy supplies for volunteers, presenting herself as the tireless mother who wouldn't rest until her babies came home. The store's cameras showed her loading coffee, water, and snacks into her cart. Her face was composed in the practiced expression of someone bearing unbearable weight with dignity. Then she checked her phone. And she smiled. Actually smiled. A genuine expression of satisfaction that completely contradicted the grieving mother persona she'd maintained for a week. The timestamp on that footage was particularly damning. 7 days after her children disappeared, Molly Brooks Murray was smiling at something on her phone screen. When investigators eventually gained access to her phone records, they discovered what had caused that smile. A text message from Derek Hammond's burner phone. Simple. 3 words. Package secure. Everything quiet. Package. That's how they referred to Lilly and Jack. Not your kids or the children. Package. Like something being shipped from one location to another. But the convenience store footage was just one example. Investigators found dozens of similar moments. At a gas station, captured looking bored while supposedly organizing a search grid. At her home, recorded by a neighbor's security camera, laughing during a phone conversation just hours after a tearful press conference. Each moment revealing the truth behind the performance. Witness statements began painting a similar picture once investigators knew what questions to ask. Volunteers who had spent days searching alongside Molly reported things that had seemed slightly odd at the time, but had been dismissed as the behaviors of someone in shock. One volunteer, Patricia Nguyen, gave a statement that particularly interested investigators. She recalled asking Molly about Lily's favorite places, spots where a scared 6-year-old might try to hide or go for comfort. It was a logical question. Children who wander off often head toward familiar locations. Parks they love. Friends' houses. Places that feel safe. Molly's response had been strange. She'd paused for a long time, as if trying to remember. Then she'd given vague answers that didn't include any specific locations. For a mother talking about her missing children, Patricia later told police, she seemed remarkably disconnected from their daily routines and preferences. It was like she was describing kids she barely knew. Another volunteer, Marcus Williams, reported something even more disturbing. On day 12 of the search, he'd been working a grid with Molly in a heavily wooded area. At one point, Marcus suggested they redirect toward a section that hadn't been thoroughly searched. Molly had immediately shut down the suggestion, insisting that area had already been covered extensively. But when Marcus checked with the search coordinator later, there was no record of any team searching that section. Molly had been steering search parties away from certain areas that investigators would later determine were closer to the locations where evidence of the children would eventually be found. She wasn't just performing grief. She was actively managing the investigation to keep people searching in the wrong places. Local journalists who covered the story also noticed inconsistencies, though they'd initially dismissed them as the confusion of trauma. Rebecca Thorne, a reporter for the Chronicle Herald, had interviewed Molly 6 times in the first 2 weeks. Years later, she would describe feeling manipulated in a way she'd never experienced before. Molly always seemed to know exactly when media crews would arrive at search locations, Rebecca told investigators. She was always camera-ready, always had the perfect soundbite prepared. In 20 years of covering tragedies, I've never seen someone so polished in their grief. Most parents in her situation are barely functional. But Molly never seemed to forget her lines. That phrase stuck with investigators. Never forgot her lines. because that's exactly what Molly was doing. Delivering memorized content perfected through dozens of practice recordings, designed to keep everyone's attention focused on the woods and away from the truth. But perhaps the most revealing testimony came from Molly's own mother, Elizabeth Brooks. The family matriarch had initially been her daughter's most vocal defender, appearing at press conferences and organizing community prayer vigils. But as investigators began uncovering evidence, Elizabeth was brought in for questioning. And what she revealed painted a picture of a daughter she barely recognized. In the months before the disappearance, Elizabeth said, Molly had become increasingly secretive. She'd stopped bringing the kids to family dinners. She'd avoided phone calls and given vague explanations for why she couldn't visit. When Elizabeth had asked about Molly's financial troubles, rumors that had circulated through the family, Molly had become defensive and angry. The last time Elizabeth saw Lilly and Jack was March 15th, 6 weeks before they disappeared. The children had seemed subdued, Elizabeth recalled. Not their usual energetic selves. When Elizabeth asked if everything was okay, Molly had cut the visit short, claiming the kids were tired. Looking back, Elizabeth told investigators through tears, I think she was already distancing herself from them, already preparing to say goodbye. I just didn't recognize it at the time. Phone calls between Molly and her mother, some of which Elizabeth had recorded out of concern for her daughter's mental state, revealed the performance extended even to family. In one call from May 5th, 3 days after the disappearance, Molly could be heard sobbing while describing her desperate hope that Lilly and Jack would be found safe. But audio analysis of that recording revealed something disturbing. The crying had a rhythmic, mechanical quality. And in the background, barely audible, investigators could hear what sounded like keyboard typing. Molly had been multitasking during her emotional call with her mother, performing grief on the phone while doing something else that required typing. When investigators cross-referenced the timestamp of that call with Molly's computer activity logs recovered from her devices, they discovered what she'd been typing. She'd been updating a spreadsheet, tracking payments and expenses related to the conspiracy. While sobbing to her mother about her missing children, she'd been managing the financial logistics of selling them. The level of compartmentalization was extraordinary. Molly had created different personas for different audiences. To her mother, she emphasized fear and helplessness. To friends, she focused on organization and hope. To media, she provided the perfect grief-stricken mother. And to Derek Hammond, she was all business, coordinating logistics and managing the operation. But investigators were also building a timeline of Molly's activities that revealed just how calculated her performance had been. On May 2nd, the morning she reported the children missing, her call to RCMP came at 9:47 a.m. But phone records showed she'd been awake and active since 5:30 a.m. What had she been doing for over 4 hours before reporting her children gone? Security footage from multiple locations provided the answer. At 6:15 a.m., Molly had been captured on a gas station camera filling her rental car and purchasing coffee. Her demeanor in the footage was calm, unhurried. Not the behavior of someone who had just discovered their children missing. At 7:30 a.m., she'd been recorded at a drive-through ATM making a cash deposit. And at 8:45 a.m., just an hour before calling police, she'd stopped at a pharmacy to pick up a prescription. All of this before reporting that Lilly and Jack were gone. The timeline revealed that Molly hadn't woken up to find her children missing and immediately called for help. She'd known exactly where they were because she'd been involved in putting them there. The 9:47 a.m. call to police wasn't a panicked mother discovering a tragedy. It was the start of a scheduled performance, executed according to plan. Investigators also uncovered evidence of how meticulously Molly had managed public perception. In the days following the disappearance, she'd maintained active control over what information was released to media. She'd positioned herself as the family spokesperson, ensuring all information flowed through her first. She'd organized which areas search teams would focus on. She'd even influenced what photographs of the children were distributed to the public. The photos Molly provided to media showed Lilly and Jack smiling, well cared for, beloved. But investigators would later discover that Molly had deliberately chosen images that were several months old, before the children's appearance had started to change due to neglect in the final weeks before they disappeared. More recent photos found on other family members' phones showed two kids who looked thinner, more withdrawn, with dark circles under their eyes. Molly had curated even the visual narrative of her children, ensuring the public would see what she wanted them to see rather than the truth of what those final weeks had been like. As all this evidence accumulated, investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a crime. They were dealing with a conspiracy so well-planned that Molly had managed every aspect of the public response, turning an entire community into unwitting participants in her deception. Every search party had been choreographed. Every press conference had been staged. Every tearful plea had been rehearsed. But the performance was about to end. Because while Molly had been managing her public image, investigators had been building an airtight case against her. And now they had enough evidence to make arrests. The question was, would those arrests lead them to Lilly and Jack before it was too late? If you're still watching, you need to know what happened next. Because the case was about to shift from investigation to action. And what investigators found when they finally moved against Molly and Derek would reveal that the conspiracy was even more extensive than they'd realized. Make sure you like this video and drop a comment telling me what you think Molly's first words were when police came to arrest her. Because what she actually said would shock everyone in that room. At 5:47 on an October morning, 6 tactical teams moved simultaneously across rural Nova Scotia. Each team had a specific target. Each target was a property connected to Molly Brooks Murray or Derek Hammond. And each team carried the desperate hope that they were about to end the nightmare that had consumed the Sullivan family for 5 months. The primary target was a hunting cabin located nearly 60 kilometers from where Lilly and Jack had disappeared. The property belonged to Derek Hammond's uncle, a man who'd passed away 2 years earlier. The estate was still in probate, the cabin technically abandoned, which made it perfect for hiding something or someone you didn't want found. Surveillance teams had been watching the property for 3 days. They'd documented smoke from the chimney despite the cabin supposedly being empty. They'd recorded a vehicle matching Molly's rental car making trips to the location, always at odd hours, always carrying bags that appeared to contain supplies. And most importantly, they'd spotted something that made every investigator's heart race. Small clothing items hanging on a makeshift clothes. While physical evidence was mounting and digital footprints were being traced, there was another silent witness to what happened to Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Cameras. Not security cameras positioned by humans, but hunting cameras. Motion-activated wildlife monitors that sportsmen place in remote locations to track animal movements. Cameras that record everything that passes by, storing footage that might sit unwatched for months until someone checks the memory cards. The Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources maintains a database of registered hunting camera locations. It's a voluntary registry, meant to prevent theft and help locate cameras on public land. When investigators realized they needed to expand their evidence gathering beyond conventional sources, someone suggested checking if any hunting cameras had been positioned near the areas of interest. Near the ATV trails. Near the locations where cell phone data had placed Molly and Derek. Near anywhere the conspiracy might have left traces. What they found would provide visual confirmation of what all the other evidence suggested, and it would reveal details that even the conspirators didn't know had been recorded. Camera number 47 was positioned half a mile from the ATV trail where the second piece of Lily's blanket had been found. The owner, a local hunter named Robert McLeod, had placed it in early April to monitor a game trail he'd been tracking. He checked it once a month, downloading footage to review animal patterns. But he hadn't checked it since before May 2nd. When investigators contacted him and explained they needed to review his camera's footage, Robert immediately provided access to the memory card. The footage was extensive. Weeks of recordings triggered by everything from deer to raccoons to wind-blown branches. Investigators began the tedious process of reviewing every clip, looking for anything that might be human activity rather than wildlife. Hours of footage. Days of work. And then, at timestamp 0547 on May 2nd, they found something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. A hooded figure moving through the pre-dawn darkness. Human. Definitely human. Moving with purpose, Not the casual gait of a hiker, but the determined stride of someone who knows exactly where they're going. The figure carried what appeared to be a large duffel bag, holding it carefully as if the contents were valuable or fragile. The camera's night vision made everything appear in shades of gray and green, but the image was clear enough to analyze. Forensic video specialists began enhancing the footage frame by frame. The figure's height, build, and movement patterns were all consistent with Molly Brooks Murray. They couldn't see the face, the hood obscured too much, but body proportions and gait analysis provided strong circumstantial identification. This was almost certainly Molly, captured on camera at dawn on the day she would report her children missing, carrying a large bag through the woods half a mile from where evidence of those children would later be found. But there was more. As specialists continued enhancing the footage, they discovered something in the background that the naked eye had missed. Two small shapes moving near what appeared to be ATV tracks. The shapes were partially obscured by trees and the limited range of the night vision, but enhancement technology revealed what they were. Children. Two small figures, the right sizes to be a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, moving near the trail. The timestamp was critical. 05:47. Before dawn. Hours before Molly would call police to report Lilly and Jack missing. This footage proved the children had been at that remote location in the early morning, proving they hadn't wandered off from home and gotten lost. They'd been transported there deliberately. Investigators pulled footage from additional hunting cameras in the area. Camera 72, positioned 3/4 of a mile away, had captured what appeared to be an ATV traveling the trail around 05:30. The timing matched perfectly with cell tower data showing phones in the area around that time. Camera 19 had captured another angle of the hooded figure, this time showing them crouching near some bushes, appearing to place something among the branches. That camera's timestamp was 05:52, and the location was exactly where the second piece of Lily's blanket would be found weeks later. The cameras had documented the crime as it happened. Not clearly enough for perfect identification in court, but clearly enough to corroborate every other piece of evidence investigators had gathered. Someone had been at those locations at those times doing exactly what the torn blanket, the cell phone data, and the ATV rental records suggested they'd been doing. But the most disturbing discovery came when video enhancement specialists used advanced technology to analyze the footage of the two small figures near the ATV tracks. Frame-by-frame analysis revealed footprints in the soft earth. Small footprints, child-sized. And the pattern of those prints told a story that made investigators' blood run cold. The prints showed signs of distress. Scuff marks suggesting someone had stumbled or been pulled. Deeper impressions indicating someone had been standing still for extended periods, possibly restrained or too frightened to move. And most chilling, the prints showed that both children had been barefoot despite the cold May morning and the rough woodland terrain. They hadn't walked to that location willingly in their own shoes. They'd been brought there, possibly carried part of the way, and made to walk barefoot through conditions that would have been painful and frightening. Forensic experts took soil samples from the area where the enhanced footage showed the footprints had been. Laboratory analysis found traces of sedatives in soil samples, specifically children's sleep medication in concentrations far higher than would occur naturally. Someone had given Lilly and Jack Sullivan medication before transporting them to that remote location. The children hadn't just been taken. They'd been drugged to ensure compliance during transport. This evidence transformed investigators' understanding of what had happened. This wasn't a mother who had panicked and made a terrible split-second decision. This was someone who had planned every detail, including medicating her children to keep them quiet and manageable during the crime. The level of premeditation was staggering. But investigators still faced the crucial question that had haunted them from the beginning. The footage showed Lilly and Jack being transported to that remote location on the morning of May 2nd. But where were they now? The hunting cameras had documented one stage of the conspiracy, but there had to be more locations, more movements, more stages to whatever plan Molly and her co-conspirators had been executing. The answer came from reviewing footage from other cameras scattered throughout the region. Camera after camera, piece by piece, investigators began reconstructing a timeline of movement. The hooded figure appeared on multiple cameras over a 3-hour period that morning, traveling between locations, each time carrying the duffel bag or returning without it. The pattern suggested someone establishing a trail, planting evidence at multiple points to create the appearance of children who had wandered through the wilderness and gotten progressively more lost. But one camera captured something different. Camera 88, positioned near a rarely used logging road 4 miles from the main search area, showed the same hooded figure around 07:15. But this time they weren't alone. A second figure, clearly male based on build and height, was visible in the frame. The two figures appeared to be having conversation, though no audio was available. After several minutes, they separated. The hooded figure, Molly, returned toward the main trail system. The male figure headed deeper into the woods, following the logging road toward areas that would later be identified as containing seasonal hunting camps and abandoned cabins. That male figure matched Derek Hammond's build and movement patterns. This was visual confirmation that he'd been at the scene, that he'd been coordinating with Molly, that this had been a two-person operation at minimum. The footage corroborated the voice recordings from the smart home device and provided additional evidence of conspiracy. Investigators now had a timeline. Dawn movements on May 2nd, establishing false trails and planting evidence. A meeting between two conspirators captured on camera. And one person heading toward remote structures where children could potentially be hidden. Every piece of evidence was pointing the same direction, building an overwhelming case, not just that Lilly and Jack had been abducted, but that the abduction had been meticulously planned and executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. What the cameras had seen, recorded in silent surveillance that the conspirators never knew existed, was proof of calculated deception. And that proof would become crucial in building a case that would hold up in court. Because video evidence, especially from multiple independent sources that corroborated each other's timestamps and locations, was nearly impossible for defense attorneys to discredit as circumstantial or coincidental. The children had been there. They'd been drugged. They'd been barefoot and distressed. And they'd been deliberately transported to remote locations by people who had then spent weeks pretending to search for them while knowing exactly where they'd been taken. The cameras had captured the truth that everyone's tears and public pleas had been designed to hide. But investigators needed more than documentation of what had happened on May 2nd. They needed to find where Lilly and Jack were now, 5 months after that Dawn conspiracy had been executed. And the hunting camera footage, while providing crucial evidence of the crime, didn't show where the children had ultimately been taken or who else might have been involved in hiding them. The investigation was accelerating. Physical evidence, digital footprints, audio recordings, and now video documentation had created an overwhelming case against Molly and Derek. But the most important question remained unanswered. Where were two 6-year-old and 4-year-old children right now? Were they still alive? And how many people were involved in keeping them hidden? Those answers were about to emerge from an unexpected source. Because while investigators had been building their case against the known conspirators, they'd also been monitoring communications and financial transactions. And that monitoring was about to reveal that this conspiracy was even bigger than anyone had imagined. That Lilly and Jack Sullivan hadn't just been hidden. They'd been sold. And the network that had purchased them was still active, still operating, still trafficking children while law enforcement had been focused on wilderness searches. If you're still watching, you need to know what happens next because this case is about to expose something that will change how child trafficking is investigated across Canada. Make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling me what you think investigators found when they started following the money. Because the truth is more horrifying than anyone expected, but it's also the key to finding not just Lilly and Jack, but potentially dozens of other missing children. While investigators were analyzing hunting camera footage and building their evidence against Molly Brooks Murray, she was delivering the performance that would have won awards if it had been acting instead of deception. Every public appearance, every tearful interview, every desperate plea for her children's safe return, all of it calibrated, rehearsed, perfected through those 43 voice memo practice sessions. The RCMP's Behavioral Analysis Unit was brought in specifically to review Molly's public conduct. These specialists study microexpressions, body language, vocal stress patterns, and behavioral consistency to identify deception. They work cases where someone's truthfulness is critical to understanding what happened. And when they reviewed hundreds of hours of Molly's public appearances, they found patterns that would become textbook examples of performative grief. Dr. Sarah Chun led the analysis team. She'd been studying deceptive behavior for 15 years, had consulted on dozens of high-profile cases, and had testified as an expert witness in multiple trials. But she would later describe watching Molly's performances as one of the most unsettling experiences of her career. It wasn't that Molly was bad at faking emotion. It was that she was too good at it. Every micro-expression was controlled. Every gesture was calculated. Every emotional response was perfectly calibrated to generate maximum sympathy while deflecting potential suspicion. Real grief is messy. It's inconsistent. People experiencing genuine trauma have moments where they can't maintain composure, where their emotions override their self-control, where they say or do things that seem out of character because they're overwhelmed. Molly never had those moments. Her grief was always perfectly contained, always camera-ready, always exactly intense enough to seem genuine without being so extreme that it made people uncomfortable. That level of control is a red flag. Most people can't maintain a false emotional state for months. They slip. They have moments where their true feelings show through. But Molly never slipped, which suggested she'd been practicing exactly this kind of emotional performance for long enough that it had become second nature. The analysis team identified specific techniques Molly used that are common among skilled deceivers. She frequently touched her face during emotional moments, a gesture that creates vulnerability and authenticity in observers. She made extensive eye contact with cameras, which builds connection and credibility. She used specific phrases repeatedly, creating consistent messaging that made her seem reliable and trustworthy. And she positioned herself physically in ways that suggested openness and honesty, keeping her body language aligned with someone telling the truth. But there were also tells, subtle indicators that someone paying close attention might have noticed. When Molly described her children, her eyes didn't show the warm recognition that parents typically display when talking about their kids. She used their names, described their appearances, mentioned their habits, but without the emotional connection that usually accompanies a parent discussing their children. It was like she was reading from a script rather than accessing genuine memories and feelings. Her vocal patterns also revealed deception. When people tell the truth about emotional events, their voices naturally vary in pitch, speed, and intensity as they access different memories and feelings. Molly's voice remained remarkably consistent across dozens of interviews. Same pacing. Same emotional inflections. Same carefully modulated delivery. She was performing lines she'd rehearsed rather than spontaneously expressing genuine emotion. But perhaps most damning were the moments captured when Molly didn't know she was being recorded. Security cameras from various locations showed her in unguarded moments, and her demeanor in those clips was completely different from her public appearances. The grief vanished. The tension disappeared. She looked relaxed, sometimes even pleased with herself. The convenience store footage was the most striking example. 7 days after reporting her children missing, Molly stopped to buy supplies for search volunteers. The store's cameras captured her browsing aisles, selecting items and checking out. Her expression throughout was neutral, unremarkable. Then she checked her phone and smiled. A genuine smile of satisfaction or pleasure, completely incongruous with someone whose children had been missing for a week. Investigators eventually recovered that text message. It was from Derek Hammond's burner phone. 3 words that explained Molly's smile. Package secure. Everything quiet. Package. That's how they referred to Lilly and Jack 7 days after the disappearance. And receiving confirmation that the children were successfully hidden somewhere made Molly smile. Other security footage revealed similar moments. At a gas station, captured looking bored while supposedly organizing a search grid. At her home, recorded by a neighbor's security camera, laughing during a phone conversation just hours after a tearful press conference. At a restaurant, filmed casually eating lunch and scrolling through her phone with no visible distress 3 weeks into the search. Each moment revealed the truth behind the performance. When Molly thought she was unobserved, when she didn't need to maintain her grieving mother persona, she was relaxed and normal because she wasn't actually grieving. She knew exactly where Lilly and Jack were. She knew they weren't in danger of being lost in the wilderness. The entire public display was theater designed to keep investigators focused on searching while the real plan unfolded elsewhere. Witness statements from search volunteers began corroborating the behavioral analysis once investigators knew what questions to ask. Multiple people reported interactions with Molly that had seemed slightly off at the time, but had been dismissed as the confusion of trauma or shock. Patricia Nguyen, a volunteer who had spent several days searching alongside Molly, provided particularly detailed observations. She described asking Molly about Lily's favorite hiding spots or places the children liked to play, logical questions meant to help focus search efforts on locations kids might gravitate toward. Molly's response had been odd. She'd paused for a long time, visibly thinking, then provided vague answers that didn't include specific locations or detailed memories. For a mother talking about her 6-year-old daughter, Patricia later told investigators she seemed remarkably disconnected from the details of Lily's life. She couldn't immediately think of where Lily liked to play, what games she enjoyed, who her friends were. It was like she was describing children she barely knew rather than kids she'd been raising for years. Other volunteers reported that Molly always seemed to know exactly when media crews would arrive at search locations. She'd be camera-ready, emotionally prepared, had her messaging organized. Most parents in genuine crisis situations are so focused on the search itself that media obligations feel like burdens. But Molly seemed to prioritize her media appearances, always making sure she looked appropriate, always having the perfect soundbite prepared. Marcus Williams, another volunteer, reported something even more disturbing. On day 12 of the search, he'd been working a grid with Molly in heavily wooded terrain. At one point, Marcus suggested they redirect toward a section that hadn't been thoroughly searched according to his map. Molly immediately shut down the suggestion, insisting that area had already been extensively covered by multiple teams. But when Marcus checked with the search coordinator later, there was no record of any team having searched that section. Molly had actively redirected him away from an area that should have been searched. When investigators later analyzed which areas Molly had steered volunteers away from, they found a pattern. She'd consistently redirected people away from regions that were closer to where evidence would eventually be found, away from areas near the hunting cabin where Lily and Jack had been held, away from locations that might have led to earlier discovery of the truth. She wasn't just performing grief. She was actively managing the investigation, using her position as grieving mother and search coordinator to control where people looked and what they found. It was manipulation on a scale that required remarkable psychological control and complete detachment from her children as human beings with needs and fears. Local journalists also noticed inconsistencies, though initially they dismissed them as understandable confusion from someone experiencing trauma. Rebecca Thorne had interviewed Molly 6 times in the first 2 weeks for the Chronicle Herald. Years later, testifying at trial, she described feeling manipulated in a way she'd never experienced in 20 years of journalism. Molly always had perfect answers ready, Rebecca testified. Most parents in her situation are barely functional. They're confused, emotional, struggling to put sentences together. But Molly always had her messaging organized, always knew exactly what soundbite she wanted to deliver. At the time, I thought she was just exceptionally strong. Looking back, I realized she was performing for the camera and she never forgot her lines. That phrase, never forgot her lines, kept appearing in witness statements and investigator observations. Because that's exactly what Molly had been doing. She'd rehearsed her responses through those 43 voice memos. She'd practiced her emotional reactions until they looked spontaneous. She'd perfected the performance of a grieving mother so thoroughly that even trained professionals had been fooled for months. But perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from Molly's own mother, Elizabeth Brooks. The woman who would eventually become Lily and Jack's primary caregiver had initially been her daughter's most vocal defender. She'd appeared at press conferences, organized community prayer vigils, and publicly supported Molly through what she believed was unimaginable tragedy. But as evidence emerged, as the truth became undeniable, Elizabeth had to confront the reality that her daughter wasn't a victim. She was the perpetrator. In sworn testimony, Elizabeth described how Molly had changed in the months before the disappearance. She'd become secretive, avoiding family gatherings, giving vague excuses for why she couldn't visit or why she couldn't bring the children to see their grandmother. When Elizabeth had asked about rumors that Molly was having financial troubles, Molly had become defensive and angry, cutting the conversation short. "The last time I saw Lilly and Jack was March 15th, Elizabeth testified, her voice breaking. 6 weeks before they disappeared. The children seemed subdued, not their usual energetic selves. When I asked if everything was okay, Molly cut the visit short. She said the kids were tired and needed to go home. Looking back, I think she was already preparing herself emotionally to give them up."